The changes in the education sector, the way we assess students, the rise of digitalization and artificial intelligence, the changes in the learning environment, and many other unusual and controversial questions. We will be examining them one after the other in this channel. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and this is Education Chapter. Welcome to Education Chapter. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and I have a pleasure today to talk to Beatriz Pont from UNESCO. Beatriz, if you could put your camera on. Good morning, Beatriz. How are you today?
Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today.
Beatriz, normally those of you who follow the channel, so we do invite you to follow the channel. Those of you who have never seen this, we will have to do a kind of a preparatory meetings normally. But with Beatriz, we didn't manage to have it. So we're going kind of live without preparation. Let's see how it goes. Beatriz, normally in the preparatory meeting, I ask for a story or your story. How did you end up working on education? But maybe, we can start with that. What is your story? How did you end up working in education at UNESCO?
Okay, well, actually, I did not end up working in education. I started working in education because this is what I wanted to do since I was very young. So I studied political science and public policy and international relations, and I entered a consultative body in the government of Spain, where I learned about negotiation with unions, with employer associations, with other stakeholders. And so I'm very well versed in what you do, actually. And then I joined the OECD Directorate for Education because I'm a firm believer that education is what can contribute to make our world a better place and shape our future. So I've been working in education and education policy reform and school leadership as well, and equity for the past 25 years of my career. And a year and a half ago, I moved to UNESCO International Institute of Education Planning, where I am the head global training lead. So I'm leading the development of a new global campus to train education policy planners on how to help them to do their job.
I see. So you're primarily working with developing countries?
Now, yes. Before I was working with OECD countries, and now it's really the low and middle income countries internationally.
Very good. Very good. Can I then ask you, what are the differences? Because, I know we are here to talk about the future of education, and this is the main theme of this chat. But at the same time, since I have you now here, and I wanted to simply get to know you a little bit better, what are the main differences that you see between developed countries and developing countries with respect to the school provision or education provision? What are the challenges different, and if so, how?
Oh, this is a huge question. The challenges are similar and different. On the one hand, in many low-income countries, only less than 30% of students are enrolled in secondary education, or 40%. So they have material needs. They don't have even sometimes water in their schools. They have really getting to having a high quality education is very difficult with the situation, the context that they have. So the material infrastructure, and then the availability of teachers as well is a challenge, and they have to travel from many different places to go to school. Often they may have two jobs at the same time. Sometimes it's only schooling in the morning, and they split schooling in the morning and afternoon for children. So the number of learning hours are very low, or can be very low. Classrooms may be very packed. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. I joined IIEP just recently, and speaking to one of my colleagues who was working in a country that has huge environmental challenges, they were saying that one of the key issues is for children to go to school in the times of the rainy season, or when it rains and there's floods, there's many snakes in the floor. so they can't walk to school because they're afraid of being bitten. So the differences are abysmal between what we are used to in Europe and some of the challenges that they really face in some African countries. So that's a very large.
It's a totally different setting, isn't it?
Yes. So the context is very different, but I think the issues that they need to have a high quality education are similar. It's about a good quality curriculum, and now in many African countries, it is called foundational learning. Do they have a curriculum that is adapted? Are teachers well prepared? And to teach in the environments that they face? Do they even get to schools? Do they have assessments to understand whether students are learning well? And then equity in the system. This is a huge issue, and especially with having systems that are fair and where disabled students and others are able to participate in school buildings. Are they aligned to the pedagogical needs? What about the scheduling? So, for example, in our own country, we have a very set calendar from September to May or June or July. But in these countries, maybe the rainy seasons come and people can't go to school for a week or 2 weeks. So can they change their calendar to adapt to their different environmental cycles? And then finally, the issue of technology, how to harness technology to support teachers and schools in the best way possible. So these are some of the core issues that we could have in common, but really the level and the context is so different that how to adapt it to the context is really what matters.
Thank you for giving us this global perspective on this. I think, we have a tendency, being so much in our European bubble, we have a tendency of misunderstanding this entire different parts of the world, not being able to see at all what kind of settings, what kind of circumstances other people are living in. I do enjoy traveling. I travel a lot around the world, every time I'm going to developing countries, I actually realize how fortunate I am that I actually has been having all kinds of not only means but also the setting to receive education that later on allowed me to flourish, not only professionally but also personally. So thank you very much for this global perspective. And now, having this global perspective of yours that is very different to what we are used to here in Brussels, I'm gonna bring you the question coming from the previous webinar that we have had. That was a meeting between the 5 key leaders of this network, kind of summarizing everything we've done over the course of this European Educational Leadership Week. The question that Monica from European Commission asked was, what are the trends? Having this global perspective, what are the trends in education? If you would close your eyes, Monica used this metaphor. If you would close your eyes and you would imagine that how would education look like in 20 years from now, what would you say?
I think I would say yesterday I attended the conference on AI and a couple others, and this morning as well. And I congratulate you on the organization of this because it's been really eye-opening, I think, and a very good opportunity for conversation with so many different people and on topics that are keen to our hearts. And the AI session said the future is now. Actually, close your eyes and think of now. We're shaping the future now in our schools, so we don't need to look at the future. We need to look at now and what we need to be doing now to improve our future. So we can think about reimagining what we want, but we need to be building it now. And I think UNESCO had a summit, Transforming Education Summit, very recently. And it was about, I think one of the outcomes was to try to reimagine the way that we learn, how we learn and what we learn, to be able to respond to the common challenges that we face in the world, which are environmental challenges, conflicts, complexity and others. And the idea is that students need to be empowered to be able to respond to these challenges. So how do schools teach students and empower students to be able to take charge of their own lives in the future? And this is something that we need to be building now. And that means that, if we want students to be leaders of their own learning, and to have them empowered to respond, to understand how to solve the challenges of the future. What do they need to look like? And what do our teachers need to do? And what do our school leaders need to be doing in order to do that? So for me, that's at the heart of this vision, is whether this is a physical building or a way of conceptualizing how we teach and learn. It goes hand in hand. And it's a key question. And for me, at the heart is policymakers. How policymakers, leaders, I would say system leaders and school leaders and middle leaders, how do we allow for this empowerment of students at the school level? And so that means that policymakers need to think differently in the way they make policy, which is a very currently, or in the past, very linear. Thinking about policy, we design a policy, we implement it, then we evaluate it, and we put it back out again. And that vision for this type of schools that we want is not valid at all. You don't design a policy based only on a textbook evidence.
So how can we then establish a system to build an effective educational policy? How can we create? I don't know. In my MBA classes, they taught me what is called the design thinking. That design thinking methodology, that we have all kinds of feedback. We're introducing our clients into it. We're trying to create a product with them. And it's an ongoing change. How could we create a system in an education sector which is very regularized, which is very fragmented, which is often top-down, managed in many countries from top-down? How could we really establish this kind of laboratory for change and a culture of continuous innovation for policy?
I think, one of the ways is I think the concept is how to close the gap between policymaking and schools. And what policymaking is here in ministries, in offices, and then there's schools and what they're doing every day. And what is there in between, and does policy really reach schools? So with this linear way of thinking, it used to work that way because there would be circulars or some kind of communication directly to schools, and schools would more or less do what the policy line would do. But in the present, and especially in the future, there's so many people involved in education, and there's so much more capacity, and there's so much more ownership as well. So one of the things is to not think about designing policies in such a linear way, but thinking about it collectively. And that means involving stakeholders, and I've heard this left and right in the previous session, involving stakeholders from the beginning of the design of a policy, having much more of an open-ended book of the policy that involves stakeholders in creating collectively the policy. And that's more complex. It takes a lot more time, but it's much more effective because in the long run, the policy will be implemented in the schools because the principals and the school leaders and the teachers, there are more probabilities that they will believe in the policy and therefore will implement it if they have participated in shaping it. So that, for me, is something that's key, and that I've seen it happen in some education systems. It's called co-construction. And that means that policymakers need to trust. They need to provide the guidelines, but they need to trust the system to know that they will do what's best for them. And they need to allow, school leaders to know what's best for their schools and to lead those policies at the school level, and then just guide the rest of the system and provide the right boussole, the right direction of travel, the right vision that is developed, shared, but give them autonomy to be able to implement and give them the resources and the support in order to do what they need to do at the school level. So for me, that's key. And one of the things that's really important is school leaders, if they receive a reform, information on a change or a new policy that they don't believe in, they will simply just
Not do it.
not do it. So if you don't have school leaders and teachers on board, why waste a policy's
for it.
time and money? So it's
Correct.
quite important to know and to engage them, because if it's not going to work for a school, it just won't be implemented. So sorry.
Can you give me any example on this? Because I think it's a very interesting topic of how can we create a framework in which there is space for co-designing. Do you have any example of any country that does this, or any, I don't know, jurisdiction that is actually looking into it? So you can give us an example how it works, or is it just something you're heading towards and it's still the song of the future? How is it really in reality?
So while I was at the OECD, we developed a framework for effective implementation that has these 4 dimensions. The first is smart policy design. The second is inclusive stakeholder engagement. The third is a conducive context. And the fourth is bringing it all together into a strategy. And we worked with different countries to consider these processes. And we saw or analyzed. We either work with countries to see how we could support them in doing this, or analyze how some countries had done it. And particularly, we work with Wales in the UK, who was doing a curriculum reform that was very that used a co-construction process, and it took a lot of time, but you could see that the teachers were enthusiastic about it. So were the school leaders. You would go into the schools and they would all talk to you about their curriculum and what the 4 purposes of the curriculum, and they were really engaged. We also work with Norway and kind of fostered, and I think that's very much in the Nordic countries where they do have so much more of a consultation approach to policy making that is in their culture already and in their way of making policy. And so we've seen it happen there, and in Ireland in some ways as well. So I've seen it happen in some countries and also in some policies more than others. It depends on the policy as well, whether it's student assessments or curriculum, and curriculum needs to be consulted, negotiated, and then schools need to be trained, and teachers and others to be able to implement it. So some policies are more easy to consult, but it does take a long time. And I did work on it with Ireland as well, where they were doing a secondary education curriculum review, and the process, it took more than 2 years to consult. To really consult, because you can do consultations actually that are, we're just going to ask and send a document, and so what happens? Well, you actually need to be taking in the feedback that is provided and really making sure that that feedback is put through the system and is really used, and that people know that what they contributed had a purpose, and otherwise they will not do it again. So there needs to be continuous conversation, continuous feedback, and input across the system.
I think, you see, we, even within our work here in policy, we very much work on changing this culture of leadership in education, where in order to open it up even further and to make it possible, we run a number of projects. One of them is about learning schools, where we're looking into change management systems in the school context, where we indeed try to encourage teachers, school leaders, the other stakeholders, those that are somehow leading the school. It's not just policymakers, to make it an effective system of collaboration. Effective meaning that these consultations do not just happen to be consultations, but they actually have an effect on the joint version. And I think you gave this example of Wales, where indeed, if you involve those stakeholders, those school leaders, those teachers, those parents, you can actually design a curriculum that would make everybody proud and make everybody willing to work on it. And I think that's the significant cultural challenge we see here. We have a lot of discussions about that, how we could really empower the teachers to not only teach, but also to research about their interactions with the students, because the teachers need to be the first, since they are on the front lines here, they also need to be the ones to collect this data on how we should be approaching students ourselves. And they could be also a very interesting agents of change when it comes to providing this evidence and this research. We do that in other sectors. In hospital sector, for instance, we do that as well, where you have doctors researching on their interactions with patients, for instance, and how they respond to different things. I think that in the education sector we don't do that much. But coming back.
Action research. There's in countries where teachers need to have a master's, they do a lot of action research. So Finland, for example, has a lot of this type of research. Their teachers do, and but one of the I think what I've seen that changes the most is when you let student voice in, and we just had Obesu in the previous session, and whenever they talk, it allows for others to listen, really, not to stay in their vested interests, and to really listen. And so every time I visited many countries, visiting education systems, meeting from, students, parents, principals, teachers, local education authorities, the minister, or many. And whenever we visited schools and we had interviews with teachers, with students, they know who's a good teacher. They know what's happening in the school. So consulting them and is quite important, and giving them a voice changes the perspectives of parents or teachers or ministry officials as well, because they see them as their children as well. So they listen, and when they're well versed and can engage in discussions and convince, it's very powerful. And I've seen this in some countries where they had to think about changing student assessments, end of school student assessments that were highly stressful. And so you give the students the voice and they tell you what's really happening. And then you're like, okay, maybe we need to listen to them as well. And because they are the clients, they are who we need to be focusing on. So
correct. We often on our policy work, we often remind ourselves about this. It's like when we do all kinds of research, we always try to bring the students and the children, because and the parents, really, because of course when we are talking about small children, it's really the entire pedagogical adventure. The parents need to be involved, because it is also, of course, them who will be deciding about the education of their children. Where do you put them, in what kind of school, with or what kind of values, and so on and so on. So that's very, very important indeed. You're responsible at UNESCO. You're responsible for building a training for developing countries on policy development. Could you tell us a little bit about that program that you're developing at UNESCO? So it's a leadership program for policymakers for, as far as I understand, developing countries. What could you say a few words about that?
Yes. So actually, I'm at the Institute of UNESCO that's called the International Institute of Educational Planning, and the focus of this institute is to develop the capacity of people who work in ministries of education and education planning, which means, we do a 5-year plan, or we do, what is this policy going to look like, to diagnose a system, understand and develop the data required, make policy options, and think about the resources that are needed. So this institute, I'm the head of training, global training, and it's been training policy planners for 60 years, but now we're developing a global campus, and that is an online campus that brings together 3 offices. We have an office in Dakar, one in Buenos Aires, and one in Paris. And so we're going to be launching a global campus that will provide courses online and in person to planners with micro-credentials, and they're really focused on professionals who work in ministries to develop their skills and competencies and knowledge for effective planning and policymaking. And as part of that curriculum, we're about to launch a new seminar, which is called the Education Leadership Seminar. And that is a 100-hour course that's got an online module that we're going to train about what is the theory of education leadership for implementation, and the 1 week at IIEP on what is the practice of education leadership implementation. And so we have learning objectives to develop the knowledge and skills for education leaders to understand what are the key dimensions to consider when making effective change in education systems. So this will be launched in March. It starts in March, and we're going to have it probably every year at IIEP. So it's part of the curriculum for the Global Campus. It's one course, but it's one that I'm particularly proud of because we just shaped it from scratch. And the first edition we're going to have very soon.
And what kind of culture of leadership do you promote there? Is it an open culture? Is it a top? Because I could imagine, I don't know. So of course, right now, I'm just speculating with what kind of countries you're working on and what kind of leadership culture is there in those countries. What kind of culture you're trying to promote there? Is it an open culture? Is it a culture that is somehow I don't know, designed for these very specific countries? Because you see, I'm working mostly at the European level, and even in Europe, I think that there's missing elements in the culture of collaboration in many countries. In many European countries, the systems are very petrified. They are very, very top down, and there's not that much change. Any kind of change on policy when it comes to education is very difficult. So maybe, again, it's a speculation, maybe we could use your global campus to even train the Europeans at times.
Well, the course is based on the framework that I spoke before, so that you cannot have an effective policy if you don't engage stakeholders from the beginning. So that's at the heart of the leadership concept that we want to enhance. And so there are skills development sessions of how to negotiate, how to engage stakeholders, how to consult, who to consult. Often there is an exercise that's required, which is stakeholder mapping. Who are the people that are involved in education policy in this particular education, and who are they? What are their interests? How can we communicate with them? How can we involve them? What would be the win-win for them? So this is a key part of the leadership seminar. And indeed, I think the cultures that the different countries will bring with them may allow them to do this to less or more extent, depending on, the political situation that they have. So this is something I'm going to see, we're going to experience and see, we're going to train on this concept and then see how far they can get with it in their own context when they go back. But at least I think the idea is to promote that culture, to promote that concept, to understand that if you don't involve them, for me, the probability that a reform happens depends on all these different dimensions playing together. So you design a beautiful policy, but you don't involve anybody in it, the chances that it will move forward are 0, or 10%, or 20%. So I think this is trying to think of it a little bit more, not scientifically, but more concretely, on not letting it happen by hazard, but actually being much more systematic about it and thinking about it also long term as well. If you involve stakeholders now, they will own the policy, and if a new government comes in and changes the policy, there's less chance that the policy will end. So it may stay for longer in the systems themselves.
I can tell you from my own experience that making effective policy change is not, again, as you said, it's not really about putting something on paper, but it's rather about creating a framework where people can create relationships and common vision. and common path. Because
Exactly.
ultimately, in order for something to change in the school, you need a group of good people. And even if the policy says we should be teaching this or that, the way we will be teaching it, it really depends on the people that you have in that very school.
Mm.
And that's the key aspect of it, I think, creating these relationships, not only between the stakeholders, but particularly between people that are there on the ground. I can give you a number of examples here in Europe. In different countries, you have networks of teachers. They are networks of teachers. They are not really trade unions, but they are like professional networks of teachers of support. You have networks of school leaders also supporting each other, right? There where they can exchange and meet and foster relationships. And I think this is also key, to really make sure that policy and effective policy could actually occur. But what is the
This,
future? Yes.
oh, maybe I just very quickly, there's one area that is growing in research interest now. It's called the middle tier and the middle tier leadership. And that refers to leadership that is above the school level, between ministry, and it's all these
Hmm.
people who are working in education at the local level, at the regional level, who are the ones who create the the environment, the positive environment for change as well. And they need to be brought in and highlighted much more, and also develop their own capacity for change as well. So this, and they are the ones who also are able to develop cooperation approaches in different
Hmm.
systems, so that
Hmm.
and this networking. So I
Hmm.
think that's at the heart of success now. We can't do it alone. We have, if we want to have effective education systems that deliver high quality education for all our students, collaboration is at the heart.
Hmm. And what is, just to wrap it up, what is in your, I mean, I think you've mentioned at least one point already on this, but what are the, if you would have to name three takeaways about, effective policy making, what would it be? I mean, you mentioned collaboration, you mentioned being together, talking to each other, building the relationships between stakeholders. Well, how could we really, ensure that policy that we all make? Because, it's a common accusation, towards all the international organizations, that we are there in our very comfortable offices. We are all very clever. We are all very well educated. We have a lot of money, at least some of us, and we spend a lot of time on designing all kinds of policies. But what would be, how could we really bring it down? How could we really make these people benefit from it? And what could be the way forward for this?
Mm. So just one thing, I what I find is that the people working in education policy are always very passionate about improving education for children. And
Mm.
in order to prepare for this, yesterday I called one of my colleagues at IIP who works on crisis-sensitive education planning, and her team are the ones who explained to me these situations in South Sudan. And I called her, I need to think about, what the gap between OECD and countries, and since you've gone to the extremes, what do you think? And I called her, she's like, can I call you right now in Teams? She was in Cambodia in the middle of nowhere, and she's traveling every time. So they're not in their offices, they are in the field. And I think that's the most rewarding part with people who work in policy, when you go to the field and you work with people who are uh, valuing what you're giving, and you're learning from them and trying to help them make sense. But it's actually a give and take. But
Mhm.
so it's true that we are in our offices, but I think the field work is really what makes a huge difference. And I encourage any of us who work in education policy to put your feet in the schools, to go really listen to principals, to sit there for a day, to that's what you need to do. If you want change, you need to go to the schools, you need to be in a classroom, just quiet, sitting there and talk to the students and see what they're learning and see what they like, what they don't like. And then you can make policy. But so that's one of my first takeaways, is do not think top-down policy making in this traditional linear way. Policy making needs to be so much more agile, so much more adaptive to change, and need to have a lot more engagement of all of those who are in the front line. So moving away from this linear thinking to more a thinking of stakeholder engagement, partnerships with learners, with teachers, with school leaders, uh, and allowing trust for them to do what they know best how to do. The second one, I think for me, is equity. We didn't talk about it a lot, but our education systems, you can't have an education system that is excellent if it's not equitable. And so if it's not really responding to the needs of the more disadvantaged, that's a damage to our society in the long term. So education systems really need to target disadvantaged and advantaged, but if they're not targeted at early ages, the costs for our societies are really too large. So we cannot miss that opportunity to support. Equity has to be at the heart of excellence. And the third, I would say, is that technology. Technology is here, and I see so many chats and exchanges and groups of teachers and school leaders and others grappling on how to learn how to use AI. I myself teach at a university. We've been now receiving some training how to use it, but I don't see much action at the policymaking level of how to use AI, how to better integrate it in our learning systems, how that's going to change our classrooms. And so I think it's quite important that now education policymakers and policymaking tackle the different dimensions that AI can change how we teach and learn. And I think that's important.
Thank you very much, Beatriz. We do have, normally when I'm recording those videos, I am the only questionnaire and an only interviewer, but today we still have we have a public with us, and this public has also the right to ask a few questions. I do have at least 2-3 questions that I would like to ask you from the public. We have a question about the use of AI in early childhood. What is your take on it? Is there? I don't know if you're specializing in this. It's actually, maybe I can already guide the colleagues from with whoever is interested in this topic. I actually did record a video with Carlos Sanchez, who is the expert at OECD, who has developed a report about the use of artificial intelligence in early childhood education. In case you are interested in this topic, please go to our education channel, and there you can find our interview about that. But Beatriz, would you like to answer to that in any way?
Actually, I'm not an expert on this or early childhood either, so I think I would rather allow the experts to respond on that. I know that the UNESCO has recently published a report on technology in education and some of its not so positive effects as well. So I think Carlos Sanchez OECD report and UNESCO's one on technology in education and the digital divide are important resources to read.
Indeed, and the interview at Education Chapter, of course. But another question here about the co-creation, inclusion, and ownership. So we have a question from Maria. Co-creation, inclusion, and ownership are surely the pillars of policymaking and seeing beneficial results in education. How does one deal with conflicting agendas? Is there any way what we can do about that? I mean, you're working with so many countries yourself, and indeed, I think we have a challenge about this interaction between politics and policy. In some countries, I think they've managed to overcome it by building kind of deep state institution in the field of education that somehow managed to continue working on educational policy regardless of political situation. But what would be your take on it?
I think that's I've seen so many systems come and go, and new politicians arrive and they change the previous reform and drop it, and a new one comes in, and so that's one type of situation it's a pity. I think education policymakers need to think about education systems and not their own political future. But one of the ways conflicting agendas, conflict arises because there's different interests at stake. And so you need to see which are the interests at stake and tackle them directly. So if the interests are often, teachers want a higher salary. So we know from evidence that a higher salary alone does not necessarily, that will not change a teacher practice, because if I get paid more for the same thing that I do, will I change what I do? Will I be better at what I do? You need to, so you can negotiate to say, yes, we can try to find better wages, but what shall we give you instead? So the negotiation is the art of negotiation to find agendas that are common for children. I think that's where student voice comes in. When you have a conflicting agenda, sometimes it's about, people's best interest. And if you have a third voice coming in to say, actually, we need this, and then the other two kind of, their interests are not so important anymore. And so I think here, this is where bringing student voice is very important in times of conflicting agendas, to see what's the path to go. And then the other one is to negotiate, because and that's why that's co-creation and co-construction. You have to negotiate, you have to bring out the solutions. That's what negotiation is for. And we do that daily in our lives. We do that at work. And I think that needs to happen as well in education policy. And there are many bodies there, like the education councils in many education systems, where this happens and there's negotiations and points of views. I think we now have to be more agile in these negotiations.
Correct. You mentioned here the importance of students, and there was, while you were talking about that, there was a question also from the audience about how can we really empower the students to be more active there? How can school leaders and schools in general empower our children, our pupils, our students to take active role? I think it's not just students, it's also probably the parents, especially when we're talking about smaller children. How can we really involve them better in this? Is there any way we can do?
Yes, it depends on the culture that is infused in the school. So if you have a school leader who considers that this is important, and that becomes an objective of the school and an objective of the classrooms, that is, I think students are very ready at all ages to share, to lead, to take on new challenges. And I've seen it in many of the schools that I visited. You give them the voice, and that means that teachers don't just present and test, but engage students in their own learning in different ways. Maybe make them teach a class, or do other activities in the school, and then involve them in student government much more, and give them a voice on what is working at the school level, what is not working, what things can be improved. So give them a much wider voice at the school level and in the classroom level. And that's pedagogical approaches that of active learning of their own students. And I think I've seen that in many places, and there's evidence that transforms students a lot more than just passively listening and responding to exams, like giving them project-based and cross-curricular project-based approaches, or others that make them the owners of their own learning. So I think there's many different ways that can be done, but it requires changing the culture of the school, and then moving forward with that.
Correct. It's all about the culture. Beatriz, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for these answers, for being an inspiration on policy work. I think for us here at the European Education Leadership Week, we really have been trying to unlock the potential for policy and making the policy effective. You mentioned here a couple of things that are, I think, key, is that there's no effective policy without people being involved and kind of buying into it. Because otherwise, of course, we can again create lots of papers, lots of reports, but if we do not do it with them, they will never buy in. And education is a place and is a sector where the response of every single individual person that are there on the ground counts. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's the beauty of being a teacher, where you actually have an impact on the life of so many hundreds of children in your prospective school. So thanks a lot for your time. Thank you very much for the questions from the audience. I think that indeed we have had a wonderful discussion on this. And for our viewers, in case you like what you see, please give us a subscription and comment on this. What is the future of educational policy? How can we really make it effective? Maybe you can share your views on it as well. Beatriz have given us a ground for it, but of course it's just the beginning of our discussion, and we can continue that online. And once again, Beatriz, thank you very much for your time. And for those of you who will stay with us within the European Educational Leadership Week, we are now having a break, and we're coming back at 12:30, is it? Where we're gonna have another webinar coming up. So I would like to thank you very much for your time, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to join you, and congratulations, Danielle, and all your team for putting on this marvelous week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay.